if we look back at the 30 years that have passed since the protests in 1989, I think we can see that those events spurred economic reforms in China, but that there have not been any political reforms. And while I would say that in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, China was moving towards a more universal view of human rights. China ratified all 6 of the 9 core human rights conventions at the UN, and China revised its criminal procedure law, made amendments to the constitution stating that human rights are to be protected in China. So there was a reason for optimism, I would say, in the first 2 decades after 1989. But in the last decade or so, China's really shifted and explicitly stated that China has Chinese values and that those are different to the universal definition of human rights. So there's been a clear stance against the liberal democratic conception of human rights in China, which is rather sad to see, and it's something that concerns lawyers in China that have worked to improve legislation and practice in China over the past 3 decades. There's been documents circulating, such as document number 9, which says that China should defend itself against the 7 perils, which include 7 dangers to China, which include universal values. China definitely has gone from being a passive player at the UN, a status quo keeper, to active participation in the international human rights regime and participating in setting standards and also changing norms. And is that a problem? Yes, insofar as we can assume that China's ambitions are based on the domestic political system. So the vision that China has for its domestic governance is also what China is promoting internationally and at the UN. So China's definition of human rights differs. I mean, China has always emphasized, or the Chinese Communist Party, I should say, has always emphasized the right to development over individual rights, civil and political rights. And the universal definition of human rights, and the reason we have human rights, is to protect individuals against abuses of the state. But China is seeking to redefine that a bit and instead emphasizing the right of developing countries, like China, the right of China to develop. And that, of course, disrupts the way we have organized the international human rights protection system. When you sign up to the international human rights treaties, you agree to be scrutinized by international or UN special procedures, they're called. And China has accepted visits by, for example, the UN Special Rapporteur against torture, on the right to education. But all those visits, took place in the early 2000s. And recently, UN special procedures that have done missions to China have complained that China is obstructing their possibilities to scrutinize China's human rights record, and also that China is seeking to influence and prevent criticism against China at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. One example is China seeking to prevent civil society organizations from participating in the UN review of China's human rights record, which is part of the human rights package. When you sign up to these international treaties, you also agree to be scrutinized and to allow civil society to play a role in these review processes, and for civil society organizations to submit so-called parallel reports or shadow reports, giving their view on China's human rights record. And China has prevented civil society organizations from taking part in those reviews, from coming to Geneva and to take part. More subtle ways of perhaps some people call it disrupting the international human rights system, other people call it undermining the human rights system, would be that China has introduced new resolutions at the Human Rights Council where the whole concept of international human rights norms as universal and indivisible are being stretched. So instead, China prefers us to talk about win-win cooperation rather than holding states accountable for their human rights record. So it's both preventing the human rights system from functioning as it is supposed to function, but also introducing new norms that make the universality of human rights into question. Whatever you talk about in relation to China now, when you talk with China, the Belt and Road Initiative is sort of what China wants to present as its major human rights achievement. And it is interesting to see how it is influencing also, it's called discourse engineering, where you can track in formal official UN documents these days, and in the UN Secretary General's speeches when he was at the BRI forum in May, he talks very positively about BRI as more or less the same as Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. So I would say that China's been rather successful in introducing, promoting its foreign policy at the UN. I think for sure we have influenced China, and when we talk a bit too sloppily about China as well, I mean, we're talking about the Chinese Communist Party on the one hand, and then we're talking about all the lawyers and scholars that we collaborate with to support them in improving the legal system in China. And of course, I think it would be very misguided to stop engaging with Chinese scholars and lawyers that are working to improve the legal system and human rights in China. Well, I think there are examples where China has advanced, and I think there's definitely been a shift from us talking a lot about how we will influence China and how China will develop towards a democracy or collapse, and that's not happened. Instead, what we've seen in the last few years is that China has shown a lot of authoritarian resilience. It's not about to collapse, it's not about to democratize. And instead we can see examples of where China is having an impact on international norms and norms here in the West. Countries that are more reluctant these days to criticize China's human rights record than they were maybe 30 years ago. So whether you want to call that an authoritarian advance or not, but I think there are examples of China influencing democracies in Europe just as much as we are trying to influence China. The most effective way to impose censorship somewhere is through self-censorship. You don't know exactly where the line is drawn. You don't know exactly, because of course these rules aren't explicit or written, and they also keep changing. So that's a very effective way to have people impose self-censorship. And there is, I sense also, even here in Sweden, which is a very stable liberal democracy with a very high degree of protection for human rights. There is a fear that saying things that could be perceived as critique of China is risky and could have an impact on our economic relationship with China. So I think even here in Sweden there is a degree of self-censorship.